Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. US President Donald Trump says universal 10% tariffs on all imports to the United States will begin on April the 5th. Certain countries will face higher tariffs due to US trade deficits, including China, the US, the EU and India. Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Australia's Anthony Albanese are among leaders who criticised Donald Trump after he announced the sweeping import taxes. Trump says the move would make America rich again and claims he has been very kind. Myanmar's earthquake death toll passes 3,000 as hospitals overflow and medicine shortages alarm relief groups. Meanwhile, the isolated junta leader could gain legitimacy for seized government with trip to Thai regional summit. Israel announces a major expansion of military operations in Gaza, saying large areas of the enclave will be seized. This comes amid fighting where reported Israeli strikes have killed 60 people in the Gaza Strip. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrives in Hungary in defiance of his ICC arrest warrant. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán says Hungary will not detain Netanyahu despite the international court order. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has travelled to Brussels to discuss a path towards peace in Ukraine and NATO's priorities. Rubio's visit to Belgium comes at an unprecedented time for the alliance as US President Donald Trump questions the collective defence principle. Taiwan's defense ministry on Thursday reported a surge in Chinese military activity as Beijing ended a second day of military drills. The ministry says it detected 59 warplanes and 23 Navy ships operating around the island. Israeli military aircraft carries out strikes in Syria's capital Damascus and the central province of Hama in the latest wave of attacks. State media says the strikes hit near a scientific research centre and an airport in Hama. Our top story now. Donald Trump has launched his most aggressive trade action yet, imposing a 10% baseline tariff on all US imports and higher rates on countries he accuses of unfair trade practices. India faces a 26% duty, while China will see a total levy of 54%. The European Union is hit with a 20% tariff, Japan with a 24% one, and Vietnam with 45%. Cambodia and others even face steeper penalties. The move marks the most significant shift in global trade rules in 75 years. In response to the tariff, stock markets have plunged, with Japan's Nikkei 225 that collapsed over 4%, Hong Kong's Hang Seng dropped 2.4%, and US stock futures nosedived. Safe haven assets like gold surged to record highs and yen strengthened. Analysts warn that these tariffs could trigger inflation, slow global growth, and push multiple economies into recession. While Canada and Mexico are spared, other key trade partners are bracing for impact. Trump declared the move as an act of economic independence, but critics call it a nuclear bomb on global trade. The US Treasury has warned against foreign governments against retaliating, with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stating that any countermeasures would escalate tensions further, increasing the risk of a prolonged and destabilizing trade war. Let's take a listen to what Trump had to say.
We will charge them approximately half of what they are and have been charging us. So the tariffs will be not a full reciprocal. I could have done that, yes, but it would have been tough for a lot of countries who didn't want to do that. I'd like to see if you look at Switzerland, 61% to 31%, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. Oh, look at Cambodia, 97%. We're going to bring it down to 49. They made a fortune with the United States of America. United Kingdom, 10%, and we'll go 10%. So we'll do the same thing. South Africa, 60%, 30%.
President Trump Trump's new tariffs faced widespread criticism from US business groups, warning of negative impacts on jobs, costs, and the economy. While some supported the move to protect domestic manufacturers, the broader consensus raised concerns about inflation and retaliatory measures. Meanwhile, the German Automotive Industry Association criticized Trump's new tariffs, warning they would harm US consumers, companies, and the global car industry. It called on the EU to respond forcefully while remaining open to negotiations. While Australian Prime Minister Albanese and his rival Peter Dutton vowed to protect national interests amid potential US tariffs on Australian beef. While rejecting retaliatory tariffs, Australia focuses on expanding exports to Southeast Asia and India, despite US criticism of its tech laws and beef ban. Here is what he said.
This is why our government will not be seeking to impose reciprocal tariffs. We will not join a race to the bottom that leads to higher prices and slower growth. We will stand up for Australia. We will continue to make the strongest case for these unjustified tariffs to be removed from our exporters. Our existing free trade agreement with the United States contains dispute resolution mechanisms. We want to resolve this issue without resorting to using these, as we do support continued constructive engagement with our friends in the United States.
Colombian Foreign Minister Laura Sarabia stated that Colombia remains competitive in the US market despite Trump's 10% tariff. President Gustavo Petro criticized the move, emphasizing that tariff changes should focus on job creation, not protectionism. Here is what they said.
Todos los países están en las mismas condiciones e inician en el mismo aumento, lo que consiste en que nuestro mercado sigue siendo competitivo y que nuestro mercado colombiano sigue siendo realmente valioso en el mercado.
La noticia en general es mala porque pues estamos restringiendo el comercio, estamos poniéndole barreras al comercio y eso no resulta bueno. Yo creo que el comercio libre, el comercio abierto, sin restricciones, beneficia a todos. Pero que se haya impuesto un arancel base del 10% a todos los países nos deja en igualdad de condiciones. Y de pronto aquellos países que tienen aranceles más altos quedan en desventaja frente a los que tienen la base.
European politicians and a German industry group criticise US tariffs announced by the US president, calling for a measured response. The UK hopes its economic deal with the US will reduce the impact of the 10% tariff. The EU, facing a 20% tariff, aims for a proportional response to protect its business and its citizens. Here's what Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President, had to say.
Trump's announcement of universal tariffs on the whole world, including the European Union, is a major blow to the world economy. I deeply regret this choice. Let's be clear-eyed about the immense consequences. The global economy will massively suffer. Uncertainty will spiral and trigger the rise of further protectionism. The consequences will be dire for millions of people around the globe, also for the most vulnerable countries, which are now subject to some of the highest.
Brazil is evaluating potential responses to the US's 10% tariffs, including using the word World Trade Organization for defense. Congress approved a bill outlining a framework for trade retaliation, which requires presidential ramification. Brazil remains open to dialogue, disputing US claims of reciprocal tariffs, citing ongoing trade surpluses with the US. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney vowed to fight against US tariffs, warning they would disrupt global trade. While Canada was not directly targeted by the latest tariffs, existing US levies on steel, aluminium and potentially the auto sector remain in place. Carney pledged countermeasures to protect Canadian workers, emphasising the need for unity and forceful action. Beijing strongly opposed the new US tariffs, pledging countermeasures to protect its interests. China argued that the tariffs violate international trade rules and harm global economic development. It called for the US to cancel the tariffs and resolve trade differences through dialogue, warning that trade wars have no winners. Japan's trade minister expressed strong regret over the US new tariffs, 24% on Japanese imports, urging Washington not to apply them. He warned that the tariffs would negatively affect the US economy by hindering Japanese investment. Japan also raised concerns that the tariffs violate WTO rules and the US-Japan trade agreement. Here's what Yoshimasa Hayashi, Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary, had to say.
今般の発表を受け、改めて米国政府に対し、今般の措置が極めて遺憾である旨伝えるとともに、措置の見直しを強く申し入れたところでございます。今般の措置をはじめ、米国政府による広範な貿易制限措置は、日米両国の経済関係、ひいては世界経済や多角的貿易体制全体等に大きな影響を及ぼしかねないと考えます。
Thailand's Prime Minister said the country has a strong plan to manage the 36% US tariffs and hopes to negotiate a reduction. The government aims to mitigate the impact of the new levies on its economy. Moving on now to our coverage of the earthquake in Myanmar, the deadliest natural disaster in years. A 7.7 magnitude earthquake that killed over 3,000 people has unexpectedly bolstered the position of the ruling general Min Aung Hlaing. The disaster has opened diplomatic channels that had largely been shut since the junta seized power in 2021, triggering a brutal civil war. Despite the devastation, Myanmar's state television confirmed that the junta has announced a temporary ceasefire and their leader is scheduled to visit Thailand for the BIMSTEC summit, signalling a bid to re-establish regional ties. Let's listen to what the Myanmar state media's broadcast had to say.
အင်တန်ကြောင့်ထိခိုက်ခံစားနေရသောတနိုင်ငံလုံးရှိပြည်သူလူထုအားစာနာထောက်ထားနားလည်သောအဖြစ်၎င်းကုညီကယ်ဆယ်ရေးနှင့်ပြည်내ထူထောင်ရေးလုပ်ငန်းများကိုအရှိန်အဟုန်ဖြင့်ဆောင်ရွက်နိုင်စေရန်ရည်ရွယ်လျက်၎င်းတည်ငြိမ်အေးချမ်းမှုကိုရှေ့ရှုလျက်တမတော်အနေဖြင့်2025ခုနှစ်ဧပြီလ2ရက်နေ့မှ22ရက်နေ့အထိကာလကိုယာယီပြစ်ခတ်တိုက်ခိုက်မှုရပ်စဲရေးကာလအဖြစ်ထုတ်ပြန်လိုက်
In recent days, Min Aung Hlaing has spoken with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, leading to a surge of international aid. Meanwhile, opposition forces continue to battle the junta, which has suffered significant setbacks in recent months. However, aid distribution remains a concern, with reports indicating that the military may be using the crisis to reinforce its control while limiting assistance to resistance groups. Despite calls for a ceasefire, military operations persist, raising fears that the disaster could further entrench the junta's power while complicating the resistance efforts to maintain public support. We now move to some breaking news. Israeli airstrikes in southern Syria has killed 9 civilians, a Syrian official has said. The attacks follow Syria's condemnation of earlier Israeli strikes as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty. Syria's foreign ministry accused Israel of destabilizing the country, with state media reporting significant damage, including the near total destruction of a military airport in Hama. Israel defended the strikes, stating that they targeted military capabilities at bases in Hama and T4, as well as infrastructure in Damascus. Moving on now, NATO allies will meet with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Thursday, seeking clarity on Washington's commitment to NATO and to Ukraine amid growing concerns over President Donald Trump's approach to European security. Trump has questioned NATO's collective defense obligations, suggesting that reducing US military presence in Europe, and pushed for closer ties with Russia. Trump is demanding that allies increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is beyond current levels, sparking fears of divisions within the alliance. European leaders want assurances that the US will remain a steadfast security partner. Meanwhile, Washington is engaged in quiet negotiations with Moscow, aiming for a partial ceasefire in Ukraine. While Trump has threatened Russian President Vladimir Putin with sanctions, concerns persist that he may ultimately seek a reprimand with NATO's chief adversary, with a crucial NATO summit approaching in June. Member states are struggling to navigate Trump's demands while maintaining unity against Russian aggression. We move to the Middle East now, where Syria denounced Israeli airstrikes as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty. The attacks caused significant damage, including the near total destruction of a military airport in the region of Hama. The Syrian Foreign Ministry accused Israel of trying to destabilize the country. State media reported strikes near a defense research center in Damascus and other locations. Israel defended the attacks. It said forces targeted military capabilities at Syrian bases in Hama and T4, along with infrastructure in Damascus. A war monitor has reported that at least 9 are dead and several are wounded, including Defense Ministry personnel. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights confirmed the Hama military airport was completely out of service. Syrian state media and said an Israeli strike hit near a defense research center in Damascus's Barzeh neighborhood. Another raid targeted the vicinity of Hama. Vietnam's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Bu Thanh Son met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow to discuss bilateral ties. Son reaffirmed Vietnam's commitment to Russia as a top strategic partner, while Lavrov called Vietnam a priority in Russia's Asia-Pacific policy. Lavrov talked about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Предоставили соответствующую информацию о наших подходах в нынешней ситуации и будем добиваться урегулирования конфликта с обязательным устранением первопричин его возникновения, а лучше сказать, первопричин его создания, сознательного создания западными кураторами киевского режима, который пришел к власти в результате антиконституционного госпиталя.
The ministers further talked about the steady growth of their comprehensive strategic partnership. They pledged to boost cooperation in energy, transport, science, agriculture, culture, and education. Both sides emphasized the importance of the Vietnam-Eurasian Economic Union Free Trade Agreement. Son requested Russia's continued support for the Vietnamese community and proposed visa exemptions for ordinary passport holders. Both leaders agreed to uphold international law, including the 1982 UNCLOS, to maintain regional peace and stability.
Работа по ограждению наших экономических, финансовых связей от подобного влияния, подобного рода незаконных рестрикций идет, и сегодня мы договорились ее ускорить, чтобы никто не пытался подвергать сомнению, тем более подрывать законные права России и Вьетнама, развивать сотрудничество в соответствии с достигнутыми договоренностями, в полном соответствии с международным правом.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrived in Hungary early on Thursday for a meeting with Prime Minister Viktor Orban. This marks his first trip to Europe since the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against him over alleged war crimes in Gaza. Hungary, despite ratifying the ICC statute, does not consider itself bound by its provisions. Orban extended the invitation soon after the warrant was issued, ensuring Netanyahu would not face arrest. The visit has been kept unusually secretive, with no prior announcements from either government. Netanyahu is set to meet Orban and the Hungarian President Tamás Sulyok during his stay. His return to Israel is scheduled for Sunday. Over to the Middle East now, where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced on Wednesday that the military is intensifying its offensive in Gaza, dissecting the enclave and seizing territory to pressure Hamas into releasing more hostages. Let's take a listen to what Netanyahu had to say.
לילה ברצועת עזה העברנו הילוך. צה"ל תופס שטחים, מכה במחבלים, הורס את התשתיות, ואנחנו עושים דבר נוסף. אנחנו תופסים את ציר מורג. זאת תהיה הפילדלפי השנייה, ציר פילדלפי הנוסף, משום שאנחנו עכשיו מבטרים את הרצועה, ואנחנו מוסיפים את הלחץ צעד אחר צעד, כדי שיתנו לנו את חטופינו. וככל שלא ייתנו, כך הלחץ יגבר, עד שייתנו.
His remarks come as Israeli airstrikes kill 34 people, including a UN building in Jabalia. Israel's defense minister confirmed plans to expand military operations, securing large areas under Israeli control. Here's what Stefan Jurek, spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, had to say.
The Secretary General is shocked by the attacks of the Israeli army on a medical and emergency convoy on March 23rd, resulting in the killings of 15 medical personnel and humanitarian workers in Gaza. Medical personnel and humanitarian emergency workers must be protected by all parties to the conflict at all times, as required by international humanitarian law. Since October 23rd, at least 408 aid workers have been killed in Gaza, and at least 280 of them have been United Nations humanitarian workers. The Secretary General honors all humanitarian workers who've been killed in this conflict and demands a full, thorough, and independent investigation in these incidents.
Meanwhile, Hamas has rejected the latest Israeli truce proposal, accusing Israel of blocking mediator efforts by Egypt and Qatar. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza worsens as food shortages force bakeries to close, with residents struggling to find bread. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry condemned Israeli attacks on UN facilities, while UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an independent investigation into recent deaths of emergency responders in Gaza. As international calls for a ceasefire grow, Israel remains focused on its military objectives, with hostilities showing no signs of de-escalation. Over to the African continent now, where according to an activist group, Sudan's paramilitary Rapid Support Forces have killed at least 85 people in a week of attacks in the south of Khartoum. The Sudanese Resistance Committee reported the ongoing RSF assaults on villages west of Jebel Avliya, leaving dozens of people injured. The Emergency Lawyers Group said that over 15 villages were targeted, with over hundreds wounded. The RSF, which is led by Mohamed Hamdan Diaglo, has been fighting Sudan's army since 2023. Last week, Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan declared Khartoum liberated after fierce battles. Daglo later acknowledged the RSF had withdrawn from the capital. Despite the army's gains, Sudan remains divided. The military controls the east and the north, while the RSF dominates much of Darfur and parts of the south. The war has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with over 12 million people displaced and famine declared in parts of the country. The UN warns of worsening conditions as violence continues. Elon Musk's social media company X has filed a lawsuit against the Indian government, accusing it of misusing the Sahyog portal to censor content on its platform. X claims the portal grants government officials wide-ranging power to issue takedown orders without following the proper legal procedures, violating India's digital laws. The government defends Sahyog, arguing it is necessary to combat harmful online content and insists it only issues notices rather than blocking orders. X argues that these notices lead to arbitrary censorship. The case follows previous tensions between X and India, including disputes over content removal and a 2022 lawsuit. X's appeal in this case is currently being heard in Karnataka's High Court. The lawsuit comes amid Musk's growing business interests with India, and with Starlink and Tesla making inroads in the country, potentially giving Musk leverage in his legal battle with the Indian government. All BIMSTEC leaders are expected to attend this week's summit in Bangkok, but Myanmar junta chief Min Aung Hlaing's participation remains uncertain following an earthquake in the country. A moment of silence has been observed, keeping in mind the victims of the tragedy. The summit, running from April the 2nd to the 4th, brings together leaders from Thailand, Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka and Bhutan. BIMSTEC focuses on multilateral sectoral cooperation in the Bay of Bengal region. Discussions are expected to cover trade, connectivity and regional security. This meeting comes amid growing economic ties between BIMSTEC nations and broader efforts to strengthen regional integration. Thailand, as host, aims to push for deeper collaboration across multiple sectors. The Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation is an international organization of 7 South Asian and Southeast Asian nations, housing 1.73 billion people and having a combined gross domestic product of $5.2 trillion. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived in Bangkok today. NewsX World will bring you an exclusive coverage of the summit. Stay tuned. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world. Thank you.